We're going through the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, and we made it to Hebrews chapter 11, and we're realizing that Hebrews chapter 11 is all about the Old Testament. It's a chapter full of names of people from the Old Testament who, by faith in God, accomplished great things. And so we've been taking our time and thinking about each of the people that are mentioned and reading some of their stories, and so we're using the New Testament to learn about the Old Testament. And hopefully it's been a blessing to us and to our faith in Jesus. Today we're just going to review the two people we talked about last week. So if you were here, hopefully you remember some things. If you weren't here, you'll learn some of the things as we go through our review today. Each week I've been telling you to remember how the book of Hebrews defines faith. That's not what I'm asking you today. I'm going to ask you anyways. Can someone tell me how the book of Hebrews defines faith? Excellent! Somebody actually memorized it. That's good. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. That's what it is. Terry? Yeah.
I got the word to the confidence, I got sure, and I got a certain instead of assurance.
That's because there's different ways to translate the same words. And this passage would be an example of that. So maybe one translation says confidence, and one says assurance, and one says certainty, and one says sure, or something like that. It's all the same. It's the same thing. There's different ways to translate the same phrases. So faith is confidence of what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Somebody during the week this week made a good point to me and said, the Bible says other things about faith too. And that's true. Here's another verse that talks about what faith believes. Faith believes that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. You heard that verse before? Romans 8, verse 20. This is another good verse from the Bible to memorize when it comes to faith. God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. So let's use this verse, Romans 8:28, to review what we talked about last time. Last time we talked about Joseph. Right? We went through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then we got to Joseph. What bad things happened in Joseph's life that seemed to be insurmountable? So he was sold into slavery. That was one bad thing. His brothers hated him. And that was a bad thing because he had 10 brothers. It's one thing if you got one brother and he hates you. If you have 10 brothers and they all hate you, this is a bad thing. What else? He was put in prison for years. He was falsely accused of rape. That's what he was accused of, falsely. And nobody believed him.
Even when he thought he had a chance of getting out of prison, they forgot.
And so even in prison, there was a time when he had a chance where he thought he would get out of prison, but then the person who was going to help him forgot about him. And so he sat in prison even longer. And you add these things up and you think, this is about as bad of a life as someone could possibly have. Hated by your brothers, sold into slavery into another country, falsely accused of a crime you didn't commit, thrown in prison, and then not able to get out of prison, even though you should get out of prison. And that was Joseph's life. All right, but we just read, God works for the good of those who love Him, and everything. How did God miraculously work all those things out for good? So eventually the guy who forgot about him remembered him, and he got out of prison. He became the second in command of all of Egypt. And as the second in command of all of Egypt, what did God use him to do? Save his family. And so Joseph's the one who gets his father Jacob and those brothers who had hated him to all come to Egypt and be saved. And what were they saved from? A famine. And in saving his own family, who else did Joseph save? All of Egypt, and it sounds like a lot of people from around the world. Because God foretold to Joseph what was going to happen. And God used Joseph to store up food and sell that food to people. And He saved a whole bunch of people's lives, including his own family.
if you look at each thing that happened, he was in charge of the household, and then he was in charge of a prison, and then he was in charge. Each thing gave him more experience and more knowledge about how to work things out.
Excellent. And so Nana says each thing that Joseph went through was teaching him something for the future. So he had been a servant in charge of a wealthy man's household. And then he went to jail, and we're told that he kind of became one of the leading prisoners in the jail. And this was just preparing him for leadership in the whole country of Egypt. And not only did God make those bad things good, but he used those bad things to be a positive later in Joseph's life. Right? Joseph proves that God is able to take even bad things and work them out for good. In all this, how did Joseph show his faith in God? So we see Joseph just giving thanks to God for his blessings. And eventually he talks with those brothers who had hated him. And he tells his brothers, God did all this. God did this. And I bet he had days when he was pretty down and discouraged. But through it all, Joseph trusted God's working through this. God's the one who's doing this. All right, the other person we talked about last week was Moses, and we especially focused on his birth. So what bad things were happening at the time of Moses' birth? So all the Hebrew babies, all the Israelite babies were being killed, all the boys. That was a bad thing. What other bad things were happening? Denise?
They were all slaves.
They were all slaves. So that was a bad thing. Any other bad things? Those are the two big ones. I have four little circles on your page. What else are we going to put down there? Part of what I was thinking was Moses was a baby boy who should have been killed. So for his family, what should have been like a blessing to have this baby boy, that seemed like a bad thing. And then leading into the story we read, now he was 3 months old. And so to have a kind of noisy 3-month-old baby when babies are supposed to be killed, this is all bad things. Nathan?
Well, when his mother put him in the basket, she had
Yeah, so just, he got put in a basket, which we look at, well, that was a good thing. Well, that was actually it's a pretty bad thing, desperate thing, to put your 3-month-old baby in a basket and float him down the river. That's how bad things were going after Moses' birth. How did God miraculously work all those things out for good?
The king's son, the daughter, pulled him out of the rushes and adopted him.
So he gets found by none other than the king's own daughter. And not only does she find him, but she likes him. And she wants to keep him. And there's more. What else happens? So his sister happens to be there and is bold enough to ask the king's daughter, well, can I find someone to raise him for you? And the king's daughter says yes. And then she goes and gets her own mother. And so Moses' own mother gets to raise him as he's a little boy. And what does the king's daughter even do for Moses' mother? She pays her. And so here's this slave family that must have been struggling to get by every day. And all of a sudden, we're going to get paid by the king to raise our own son who the king was trying to kill. He said, who worked this out this way? This God did. Right? In all things, God works for the good of those who love him. And how did Moses' parents show their faith in God? They must have raised their son to be a believer. Maybe we could say they also showed their faith in that they kept their baby. They had a baby boy, and they said, we are going to risk everything. We're going to keep this boy alive as long as we can. So, examples of faith. Joseph and Moses, everything going wrong, God can work it out for good. Nathan?
There's one thing in the story that goes everybody here.
Uh-huh.
You say he was no ordinary child.
Yeah, so open up to Hebrews chapter 11, because we see it there. May I ask that in the Bible it mentions that Moses' parents saw that he was no ordinary child. And she says, well, what does that mean? And we're not given an explanation. It just seems like somehow God alerted Moses' parents to the fact that Moses was going to do something special for God. But we're not told exactly how that was. So if you're in Hebrews chapter 11, that's where we're going to be anyways. You look at verse 23, which is the verse about Moses' parents. So Hebrews 11, verse 23. It says, by faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. We're not told how they knew he was no ordinary child. And so maybe he showed his great intelligence as a newborn baby. We don't know. Somehow God alerted them to, this is a special child that you have. Good question. All right, we're ready to move on. So last time we ended by reading Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 to 28. These are the verses about Moses. We started talking about him last time. We'll talk about him a little bit more today, and then we'll move on to what follows. So here's what it says about Moses and Moses' faith. Hebrews 11, 24. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. And so with Moses we get a number of things. Moses by faith did this and this and this. Last time we actually read about how Moses became the leader of the Israelites. And just like with all of these people, we commented on how the book of Hebrews makes it sound way better than it seems like it was. So did Moses one day decide, I want to be known as a believer in God and not as an Egyptian? And so he left Pharaoh's household. Is that exactly how it happened? Why did Moses leave Pharaoh's household? Because he killed somebody. And then Moses runs away, and how long did he spend away? 40 years, and finally, what does it take for Moses to go back to Egypt? God talking to him out of a burning bush. Right? And even in that story of God talking to him from a burning bush, God says to Moses, Moses, you're going to go back and set my people free. And does Moses say, great, I'll do that? No. Moses makes excuses. Well, who sent me? I'm not a good speaker. I don't want to go. 5 excuses Moses makes, and finally he gets sent back basically because God says you have to go back and do this, and we're running into this over and over. Why then does the book of Hebrews say, look at Moses did all of this by faith? Because through all that, he had faith in God, and through his faith, he was forgiven. He was the perfect child of God. Even though his actions were far from perfect and his thoughts were far from perfect, it was by faith that God looked at him and said, this is one of my people. He's doing everything that I want him to do. I just want us to think a little more about 3 phrases. What can we learn from this verse? He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. I think this is really applicable for us today. Right? There's constantly a temptation to enjoy what? The pleasures of this life, the pleasures of sin. We face that same temptation, especially because when we follow God, what does it look like is going to happen? Being mistreated or suffering. Right? And so Moses in life, he faced this dilemma. Should I enjoy the pleasures of sin, or should I face mistreatment for the sake of God? Do we face that same dilemma sometimes too? Right? And now Moses wasn't perfect, and boy, he had his doubts and struggles, but which one did Moses choose? To be mistreated along with the people of God. Right? We ask God for the faith to do the same thing. One of you told me recently that you're reading about ancient martyrs. You know what a martyr is? Someone who dies for their faith. And there was a man, his last name was Fox, who studied ancient Christian history and wrote a book about as many people as he could find who died for their faith. And I've never sat down and read the whole thing. I've just read parts of it. It just is amazing. Of person after person, they were threatened with this, or they were given the option to have this, and they refused to deny Christ. They chose mistreatment for the sake of God rather than the pleasures of sin. And that's what Moses did. It probably would have been pretty nice to be a prince of Egypt his whole life, don't you think? Instead, how did Moses spend the last 40 years of his life? Wandering around the desert with 2 million complaining people. 40 years. Right? Even just you look at that, which would be better? To live in a palace in Egypt or walk around the desert with all of these people? Right? Moses chose to be mistreated with God's people rather than the pleasures of sin. All right, next verse. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. First, we mentioned this very briefly last time, but who does the Bible say Moses could see? Jesus. Jesus hadn't been born. How many years after Moses was Jesus born? 1,500 years. 1,500 years later is when Christ was born. But Moses could see him because he knew God's promises of a Savior. And what was his choice here? On the one side, right, let's hold off on the heaven thought for now. But you're right. What is his choice between? Disgrace or treasures. Right? And so again, going along with being a prince of Egypt, Moses could have had tremendous wealth, or he could have a lot of disgrace. And I think sometimes we face that same dilemma too. Boy, it would be tempting to sacrifice what we believe, just to have tremendous wealth. Wouldn't that be a good thing? Disgrace or treasures? And Moses chooses disgrace because, and this is what someone was mentioning, what did he know his reward would be? Heaven. And so Moses could see ahead and say, you know what I'm going to have in heaven is so much better than even all the wealth of Egypt. I'm going to suffer disgrace so that I receive eternal life. Right? Last one. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. Right? Again, it's a little ironic because after Moses kills that guy, what does he do? Runs away. Why? Well, he's afraid. Right? But God's looking at the big picture. God says, here's Moses. He's a man of faith. Right? What was it that allowed Moses to persevere? What could he see? This is when I want you to repeat what the verse says. Just repeat back to me what the verse is saying. What could he see? Him who is invisible. You always make things so hard for yourselves. Right? He could see him who is invisible, who is... Got it. All right. Now remember what our definition of faith was? Confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not